After more than half century of experience with attempting to encourage modern development, we have learned that development is both possible and extremely difficult to achieve. Ideas of the classic theories have been formalized, and in the process, their logical structure, their significance for policy have been clarified and refined. At the same time, the analysis has also led to entirely new insights into what makes development so hard to achieve and also possible to achieve. And this fact indeed is what makes the study of economic development so very important. Good day everyone, I'm Nicole Ansi Del Wampo, and together with my partner Yarame Daliva, we'll discuss contemporary models of development and underdevelopment. To give you an idea of what to expect in this topic, first let's watch this clip.
By definition, an economic model or theory is a simplified version of reality that allows us to observe, understand, and make predictions about economic behavior. Well, what does this mean? How does it apply to us, and why do we need to simplify reality? When I ask the question, how much realism do we want in a model, most students will respond as much as possible, or 100%. But is this true? Is more realism always preferred? Let me give you an example. Suppose that it's the end of the semester, and to celebrate, I'll be having a big party at my house. You're invited, but how will you get there? You need some kind of directions, probably a map, right? Well, how much realism do you want your map to have? 100%? Stop for a moment and think what 100% realism would mean. In your map, 1 mile would equal 1 mile. Where would you possibly put it? Okay, so maybe not full scale, but surely we want as much realism as possible, right? Again, think about what this means. Your map would show every rock, every pothole, every blade of grass. Well, okay, we probably don't need or want 100% realism. Not only is it cumbersome, but the minor details tend to get in the way, distracting us from our end goal. Was that the 17th cow or the 19th cow? So, if you want to focus on the end goal, getting to the party, what level of detail do you really need? If you're like me, you're probably interested in the major cross streets closest to your destination and perhaps some general directions and major landmarks along the way. Perhaps as you near your destination or end goal, you'd want a bit more detail. It's the third cross street, fourth house on the right, that kind of thing. But again, 100% detail or realism is neither necessary nor desired. So back to the question. How much realism do you want in your model? The answer to this question is rather nonspecific. Enough. We want enough realism to allow us to achieve our end goal, to reach our destination. How do I know if there's enough? How do I determine if my model is good? Well, if my model, my simplified version of reality, is a good one, then it helps me to observe, understand, and make predictions about my topic. In the case of the map was good, that is, I have sufficient detail if I successfully achieve my end goal, if I reach the party. At various points this semester you may ask me, but in the real world, isn't it the case that, fill in the blank? Often my response to you will be to bear in mind that we are dealing with a model, a simplified version of reality. Is it perfectly realistic? No. Does it allow us to observe, understand, and make predictions about economic behavior? You bet.
In this discussion, we will be dealing with economic models, specifically some of the most influential of the new models of economic development. For the contents of the report, first we will have underdevelopment as a coordination failure, multiple equilibria, a diagrammatic approach, starting economic development, the big push. Then we have further problems of multiple equilibria, Michael Kramer's Owing theory of economic development, economic development as self-discovery, the Hausman-Roderick Velasco growth diagnostic framework, and lastly, conclusions. Underdevelopment as a coordination failure. So newer theories of economic development that became influential have emphasized complementarities between conditions necessary for successful development. So what do we mean when we say complementarities? As provided, Complementarity is an action taken by one firm, worker, or organization that increases the incentives for other agents to take similar actions. So, just like the case of agents and investments, investments must be undertaken by many agents to make the results profitable for any individual agent. So, just remember that the essence of complementarity is to make several things work well at the same time. And when doing so, it will get sustainable development underway. So that's complementarity. Now we have this picture. What does it tell you? As you can see, there's two businessmen with paddles in a boat and moving the boat towards different directions, one to the left and one to the right. So we can see that they are not coordinated with each other. And this is somehow um, connected to what we'll be discussing next. Coordination failure. It is a situation in which the inability of agents to coordinate their behavior leads to an outcome that leaves all agents worse off than in an alternative situation that is also an equilibrium. So, coordination failure. This may even occur even if all the agents are fully aware or fully informed of the alternative preferred equilibrium. So the problem here is they cannot get there because of difficulties of coordination. And there are two possible reasons why. First one, people hold different expectations. Second one, everyone is better off waiting for someone else to make the first move. To further understand this, let's try to relate complementarity and coordination failure. An important example of complementarity is the presence of firms that use specialized skills and the availability of workers who have acquired those skills.
Firms will not enter a market or locate in an area if workers do not possess those skills. And the same goes for workers. They cannot acquire those skills if there are no firms to employ them. Just like when you're applying for a job, the company is looking for employees who have experience. But how can you possess that experience when your reason for applying was to gain experience to begin with? Now see, there's no coordination at all.
And this coordination problem or failure can leave an economy in a bad equilibrium. That is,
At a low average income or growth rate, or with a class of citizens trapped in extreme poverty.
and this is where the underdevelopment trap enters the picture. It is a poverty trap at the regional or national level in which underdevelopment tends to perpetuate itself over time. So imagine if no one is willing to take the first step, how can underdevelopment um, turn into a sustainable development? So if no one is willing to um, initiate that first step, you should expect that underdevelopment will continue to persist. In many cases, the presence of complementarities create a classic chicken and egg problem. Ano ang mas nauuna? Manok o itlog? Itlog o manok? But in our case, which comes first? The skills or the demand for skills? Often, the answer to this question is that the complementary investments must be at the same time. And this will be possible through coordination. But let's say, even if the firms invested and the workers acquired the necessary skills, we will not be able to transition into a better equilibrium without the aid of government. Deep intervention. As stated, it is a government policy that can move the economy to a preferred equilibrium or even to a higher permanent rate of growth, which can then be self sustaining so that the policy need no longer be enforced because the better equilibrium will then prevail without further intervention. So, even if the government is imperfect, the government policies can still help by pushing the economy towards a self sustaining, better equilibrium. And when we achieve this self sustaining equilibrium, there is no incentive to go back to the behavior associated with the bad equilibrium. And the government will no longer have to continue the intervention since this better equilibrium will be maintained automatically. To make it simple or to make it precise, the role of government in coordinating joint investments is of utmost importance. Now we have congestion, which is the opposite of complementarity. So if complementarity increases the incentives for other agents to take similar actions, this one, congestion, decreases the incentives. So in a competitive market, there's an excess demand, and the counter pressure for prices to rise will then restore the equilibrium. Another example is the more people there are in a one lake, the more people will try to move to another lake which is less crowded. Just when we're dealing with congestion or whenever congestion is present, you just have to remember that counter pressures are very strong. So now we have multiple equilibria, a diagrammatic approach. It is a condition in which more than one equilibrium exists. These equilibria sometimes may be ranked in a sense that one is preferred over another, but the unaided market will not move the economy to the preferred outcome. So let's take a look at the next diagram. The S-shaped function reflects that the benefits an agent receives from taking an action depends positively on how many other agents will take the similar actions. In the x-axis, we can see or the label expected decision by other agents. And for the y-axis, privately rational decision. And this is can be interpreted as the response or the actions of other firms when it comes to investments. So how can we find the equilibrium in this diagram? So as you can see, equilibrium is found where the privately rational decision function or the S-shaped curve crosses the 45-degree line. Ito yun, yung S-shaped curve. So now, what do we mean when we say the possibility of multiple equilibria? So as you can notice, this function S cuts the 45-degree line 3 times. And it has resulted to points D1, D2, and D3. So these points can be equilibrium. So among these 3 points, D1 and D3 are the stable equilibrium. So why? They are stable because if expectations change to a little below or above these levels, the firms would adjust their behavior. They may increase or decrease their investment levels in a way that the action would bring us back to the original equilibrium. And also note that the stable equilibria cut the 45-degree line from above. As you can see, from above. So that indicates that the points are stable equilibrium. Now let's take a look at the middle equilibrium, which is the D2. So this point is actually the unstable equilibrium. Let's say the other firms started to invest more. That particular action of other firms will also encourage you to invest more. And if the other firms started to invest less or their investment level decrease, you will do the same. So in this case, if less investment is expected from point D2, the equilibrium will be at D1. And if the investment is a little higher, or the other firms started to invest more, the equilibrium will be at D3. So we can conclude that this point D2 is an equilibrium by chance, meaning in practice we use unstable equilibrium as a way to divide or separate the ranges of expectations from the low investment level and from the higher investment level. So as you notice, multiple equilibria has something to do with complementarity, which is an action that increases incentives for other agents to take the similar actions. Just like in my explanation earlier, when other firms started to increase their investment level, this particular firm will also do the same. Increase or decrease their investment level depending on the responses or actions done by other firms. So sometimes it also depends on the number of firms who have initiated that particular action. Kung mas maraming firms ang nag-invest or nagtaas ng investment sa particular na area, you will do the same. Kasi sa tingin mo, may benefits silang nakuha doon, so you're going to acquire those benefits as well. But if the number of firms decrease as a result of the decrease in their investment level, you will also follow their lead because you saw some discrepancies on that particular action. So there's always actions being influenced by other actions, which is the very essence of complementarity. And depending on the slope of the function and whether it cuts the 45-degree line, there can be one equilibrium or multiple equilibria. So now we have starting economic development, the big push. It is a model of how the presence of market failures can lead to a need for a concerted economy-wide and probably public policy-led effort to get the long process of economic development underway or to accelerate it. And it was pioneered by Paul Rosenstein-Roden. So what was the idea behind the big push? How can an economy that was stagnant for long centuries initiate modern growth? So according to the Roden's model, initiating industrialization is difficult in an agricultural or subsistence economy because no one wants to be the first industrialist. So why? First, who will buy the goods produced by the first industrialist? Second, how many firms will produce the new goods? And third, who will train workers for the new technology? Because as we know, even if there's someone who will want to be the first industrialist, we can change the fact that there are some still existing products that needs to be produced. And those products are still being patronized by the consumers. So being the first industrialist means taking all the risks and costs for initiating industrialization. That is entirely and completely different from the traditional way of doing things. The big push, a graphical model. So in any model or in any critical or careful thinking, we need to make assumptions and probably large assumptions to make progress in our understanding. And this analysis for the big push is no exception to this rule. So that's why we also have our own assumptions. First one, labor is the only factor of production. Second, there are only two sectors, the modern and traditional, where the wage in modern sector is equals to 1 and traditional is greater than 1. So this wage differential is to induce workers to leave their homes where they produce goods using the traditional approach. So of course, modern sector will need to pay more. 3. There exists a large number of products and in the traditional sector there is constant returns to scale. In the modern sector there is increasing returns to scale. And any good can be produced with traditional and modern technologies. But for the modern sector, the labor requirement is equal to F plus CQ, where F greater than 0 is the fixed cost and C less than 1 is the marginal cost. Number 4. An equal share of income is spent on different products. Hence, if Y is national income, the money spent on each good is Y over N, meaning there is no saving. Number 5. The economy is closed. There's no exportation opportunities. Number 6. The traditional sector is perfectly competitive. In the modern sector, for each good there is only one monopoly firm that cannot charge a price larger than one because of the competitive pressure of traditional producers. So now we have the graphical model of the big push. For the x-axis, we have the only factor of production, which is the labor. L here is the overall labor force in the economy, and N is the number of workers needed for the production, so L over N. And this F here, the assumption here is that the modern sector cannot produce until they have these F workers. But after this point, they can produce more efficiently than traditional workers. You can also think of this as the fixed cost. For the y-axis, we have the quantities produced, or we can also think of this as the values of profitability or the revenue. We have the traditional sector production function, or this 45-degree line, and the modern sector production function. Point A. If a modern firm enters but there are traditional firms in the other sectors of the economy. So this, you can see this gap here. So meaning there are still traditional firms operating in the economy. And point B, if a modern firm enters but there is no traditional firm in the economy. So completely, there are no traditional firms but only modern firms. And as you also noticed, we have W3, W2, W1, which are all the wage bill lines. And we will characterize each case in the next slides. Case 1. The modern firm would find it profitable to operate at A since its profit is strictly greater than 0 when the modern sector wage is equal to W sub 1. So in this graph, where can we find the profit? So let's take a look at this. Look at these blue lines. So at this point, this is the cost of labor. And as you noticed, it is less than the revenue here. So there's definitely profit. Since this applies to the market for any other good, each and every good is produced by modern firms. So in this case, all firms will switch to modern technology because even if there are traditional firms that use traditional approach, it is too profitable to industrialize. Now, if point A is profitable, the same goes for point B because as you can see, the cost of labor is also less than the revenue. Now, the question is, where is the equilibrium? Is it at point A or at point B? The answer is it's actually at point B. So why? Because firms will not stop at point A if they know they can operate with higher profits at point B. And since the modern wages are sufficiently low, the decision of a firm to switch to modern technology will also increase the incentives for other firms to take the similar action. And that will result to all firms to industrialize, and meaning there is no need for a big push. Case 2. The modern firm is not profitable to operate at A under this higher wage level. So why? Because as you can see, the amount of wage that needs to be paid when we're operating at point A is actually higher than the revenue. So if modern firms enter the market, they would lose money. So there's no entrance for modern firms at all. But let's take a look at point B. There's profit at point B because the cost of labor is actually less than the revenue. So it's profitable if firms operate at this point. Now, this case is actually the most interesting among the three cases because it happens to be the one that corresponds to multiple equilibria, where we can end up with a stable equilibrium of being stuck in a traditional way of doing things, or we can end up in a stable equilibrium of a modern production. Now, in this case, we have two equilibria. The first one is at point C, where all goods are produced with traditional technology, and the other one is at point B, where all goods are produced with modern technology. For case 2, there is a need for a big push that coordinates modern firms to enter the market for all goods. Case 3. Since the modern sector wage is now very high, no modern firm would enter even if they all enter simultaneously. Because as you can see, the cost of labor is now at this point, and the revenue is here. So there's a huge loss. Hence, even if there is a big push that can coordinate the modern firms to enter all markets, cost conditions are not favorable for profitable operation of the modern technology. For case 3, the economy cannot industrialize, and the unique equilibrium is at point C. Now let's try to review the three cases. Whenever the wage bill line passes below point A, the market will lead the economy to modernize, just like in the case of W sub 1. If the wage line passes above B, it makes no sense to industrialize, as indicated by W sub 3. If the wage line passes between points A and B, it is sufficient to industrialize, but the market will not achieve this on its own, as depicted by W sub 2. Other cases in which a big push may be necessary. Number 1. Intertemporal effects. So even if the industrial wage rate is 1, the same as the traditional sector wage, multiple equilibria can occur if investment must be undertaken in the current period to get a more efficient production process in the next period. Investment in the first period depresses aggregate demand in the first period, but increases it in the second or later period. But then again, investment will only be undertaken if it is profitable. That is, if demand is expected to be high enough in the second period. And this may require that many product sectors invest simultaneously. When there is a case for a big push, industrialization makes the society better off because first period income is decreased only by the fixed costs. But second period income is sufficiently increased by both the wage and profits in other product sectors to more than offset this. 2. Urbanization effects. If some of the traditional cottage industry is rural and the increasing returns to scale manufacturing is urban, urban dwellers' demand may be concentrated in manufactured goods, like foods must be processed to prevent spoilage due to the time needed for transportation and distribution. If this is the case, one needs a big push to urbanization to achieve industrialization. 3. Infrastructure effects. By using infrastructure such as a railroad or a port, an investing modern firm helps defray the large fixed cost of that infrastructure. The existence of the infrastructure helps investing firms lower their own costs, but investing firms thereby contribute indirectly to lowering the costs of other firms by lowering the average cost of infrastructure use. So the critical point is that when one product sector industrializes, it increases the size of the market for the use of infrastructure services that would be used by other product sectors and so makes the provision of these services more profitable. So last we have training effects. There is underinvestment in training facilities because entrepreneurs know that the workers they train may be enticed away with higher wages offered by rival firms that do not even have to pay these training costs. There is also too little demand by workers for training because they do not know what skills to acquire. In addition to not knowing whether firms will make investments requiring the skills, people are not born with perfect information about their comparative advantage. And this is part of the economic case for mandatory public education. Further problems of multiple equilibria. So first we have inefficient advantages of incumbency. The presence of increasing returns in modern industries can also create another kind of bad equilibrium. Once a modern firm has entered, it has an advantage over any rivals because its large output gives it low average costs. So if an even better modern technology becomes available to a potential rival, it may not be easy for the new technology to supplant the old. As a result, firms may need access to significant amounts of capital to cover losses while they build their customer base. If capital markets do not work well, as they often do not in developing countries, the economy may be stuck with backward, less cost effective industries. So, another problem of multiple equilibria is behavior norms. Movement to a better equilibrium is especially difficult when it involves many individuals changing their behavior. For instance, your choice of partner may determine much. If you naively cooperate with an opportunistic, predator type, you may be worse off than by going it alone. Only by cooperating with other good-willed cooperators may you reach the best outcome. Moreover, past experience may lead people to expect opportunistic behavior, at least among certain groups of potential business partners, which in turn raises the incentives for the potential partners to act that way. If there is nothing to be gained and something to be lost by being honest, the incentives lie in being dishonest. If many people work to enforce a norm such as honesty, each individual's enforcement burden is relatively low. So you can have equilibria where most people resist corruption, and so corruption is rare. And you can have equilibria where few resist corruption, and corruption is common. So that's how it works. We cannot rely on good organizations to prevail in competition if the rules of the game tend to reward the bad organizations. Rather, the critical importance of policies for developing or reforming institutions is highlighted, just like reform of the framework of property rights, antitrust, clean government rules, and other laws, regulations, and industry association norms that set the rules of the game for economic life. Once the new behavior assumes the status of a norm, it is much easier to maintain. Linkages. There are several ways to undertake a big push, encouraging the simultaneous expansion of the modern sector in many industries. One strategy for solving coordination problems is to focus government policy on encouraging the development of industries with key backward or forward linkages. The theory of linkages stresses that when certain industries are developed first, their interconnections or linkages with other industries will induce or at least facilitate the development of new industries. In other words, linkages are especially significant for industrialization strategy when one or more of the industries involved have increasing returns to scale, of which a larger market may take advantage of. Now we have the last problem: inequality, multiple equilibria, and growth. So, other important work being done on growth and multiple equilibria addresses the impact of inequality on growth. The traditional view has been that some inequality may enhance growth because the savings of the rich are higher than those of the poor. If at least some savings to be mobilized for investment purposes must come from within a country, then, according to this view, too high a degree of equality could compromise growth. However, the poor save at much higher rates than previously believed when savings are properly measured to include expenditures on health, children's education, and improvements on home. Moreover, where inequality is great, the poor may not be able to obtain loans because they lack collateral. Indeed, one definition of what it means to be poor is to be entirely or mostly lacking in a source of collateral. Poor persons unable to get a loan to start a business due to such capital market imperfections may get stuck in subsistence or wage employment, although they could do much better if they had access to financing or if there were a more even distribution of income. Multiple equilibria involving outcomes with virtually all citizens enjoying high incomes and outcomes with predominantly low income people can exist when imperfect credit markets provide too few people with the opportunity to become entrepreneurs. And that's what the problem of inequality, multiple equilibria, and growth is all about.
So now let's move forward to the O-ring theory of economic development. Under this, we have the O-ring model and the implication of the O-ring theory. So, what is the O-ring theory? This is a framework that was put together by Michael Kramer. He is an American development economist who is the Gates Professor of Developing Societies at Harvard University. In 2019, he was jointly awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics together with Esther Duplo and Abhijit Banerjee for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. Kramer's concept of Q is quite flexible. Other interpretations may include a quality index for characteristic of the good. Consumers would be willing to pay more for higher quality characteristics. For example, suppose that Q is equal to 0.95. Among other interpretations, this can mean first that there is a 95% chance that the task is completely perfectly, so the product keeps maximum value, and a 5% chance that it is completed so poorly that it has no value. The second one is that the task is always completed well enough that it keeps 95% of its maximum, or the third one is that the product has a 50% chance of having a full value and a 50% chance of an error, reducing the value of the product to 90%. So now let's move forward to the O-ring production function. So what is the O-ring production function? It is a production function with strong complementarities among inputs. In a simple one, this means that output is given by multiplying the Q values of each of the n tasks together, in turn multiplied by a term, say B, that it depends on the characteristic of the firm and is generally larger with a larger number of tasks. Usually, one thinks about this in terms of the input quality, such as the skill levels of workers. However, there are also the implication here for way firms interact in an economy. So the idea for the name O-ring model comes from the Challenger space shuttle disaster in the 1980, in which one small part caused the destruction of the entire space shuttle. The explosion, loss of lives along with $1 billion or something like spacecraft. And the notion here is that the parts of spaceship have to work together so perfectly that if even there's a failure of small part, the result can completely disaster. And this is something like the notion of strong complementarities in production. If something goes wrong, then a lot of value that's been added can be lost. Now, suppose that each firm hired only 2 workers. That is to make things simple. For this exposition, we let the multiplier b equal 1. In addition to the form of the production function, we make 3 other significant types of simplifying a assumption. First, firms are risk neutral. Second, labor markets are competitive. And third, workers supply labor inelastically. Example, they work regardless of the wage. If we consider capital markets, we assume that there are competitive as well. For now, we also assume that the economy is closed. So then, one result of this is that there's going to be some positive assertive matching in production. For example, in firms, you'll see high-skilled individuals grouped together in some firms, and low-skilled individuals grouped together as well in other firms. When we use the model to compare economies, this type of matching means that high-value products will be concentrated in countries with high-value skills. In this model, everyone will like to work with the more productive workers, because if your efforts are multiplied by those of someone else, you will be more productive when working with a more productive person. In competitive markets, your pay is based on how productive you are. A firm with a higher productivity worker can more afford to pay a higher wage and has the incentive to bid higher to do so, because the value of output will be higher with 2 productive workers, say, than with 1 low and 1 high productivity workers. As a result, there will be a strong tendency for the most productive workers to work together. This can be seen easily if we imagine a four-person economy. Suppose that this economy has 2 high-skilled workers and 2 low-skilled workers. The 4 workers can be arranged either as matched skill pairs or unmatched skill pairs. The total output will always be higher under a matching scheme, because Q2H plus Q2L is greater than 2QHQL.
Recall that x minus y is greater than 0 for any x that is not the same as y, so let x stand for QH and y stand for QL.
Then x2 plus y2 is greater than 2xy. This generalizes to larger numbers of workers in the firms and the economy. The result is that workers sort out by skill level because the total value is higher when skill matching rather than the skill mixing takes place. The firms that starts with high productivity workers can afford to bid more to get additional high productivity workers. Of course, every firm would like to hire the most productive workers, but it would be in that worker's interest to team up with other high productivity workers. Think of firms being formed while workers try to determine for which firm they want to work. After the high productivity workers pair off, they are out of the picture. The less productive workers are then stuck with each other. If there are many classes of skill or productivity, first the highest skill workers get together, then the next highest, and so on, such that skill matching results as a cascading process. For example, a symphony orchestra. This will be adversely affected as a whole by hiring one single poor performer. So an otherwise excellent orchestra has every incentive to be the most for an outstanding performer to replace the poor performer. Another one is the best jazz performers play and record together rather than each leading a group of poorer players. And also a restaurant with the very best chef also hires mature, highly trained, full-time waiters while a fast food restaurant does not hire a famous chef. The most vividly easy to remember is by analogy to Nobel laureate Gary Becker's famous marriage market model, which is a somewhat different but offers some additional institution. If prospective spouses care only about attractiveness, every man wants to marry the most attractive woman, and every woman wants to marry the most attractive man. So, the most attractive man and woman will marry. They are now out of the picture. So next, the second most attractive man and woman marry. This process continues until the least attractive man and woman marry. Of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and most people care about things besides attractiveness in a mate, such as kindness, intelligence, wealth, beliefs, interests, commitment, and sense of humor. But the marriage model serves as a memorable analogy. The result in the business world is that some firms and workers, even an entire income economy, can fall into a trap of low skill and low productivity while others skate into higher productivity. A numerical example can show how the firms with high skill workers can and will pay more to get other high skill workers or will have more incentive to upgrade skills among existing workers. Suppose that there are 6 workers. 3 have Q is equal to zero point 0.4 and are grouped together in equilibrium, while the other 3 have Q is equal to zero point 0.8. Now suppose that the Q of one of the workers in the first firm rises from zero point 0.4 to zero point 0.5, perhaps due to training. Similarly, suppose the Q of one worker in the second firm rises from zero point 0.8 to 1. In each case, we have a 25% increase in the quality of one worker. As you may expect, a 25% increase in the quality of one worker leads to a 25% increase in output quality. But starting from a higher level of quality, that 25% clearly translates into a much larger point increase. In the example, The first firm goes from zero point 0.4 times zero point 0.4 times zero point 0.4 is equal to 0.064 to zero point 0.4 times zero point 0.4 times zero point 0.5 is equal to 0.080. This is a difference of 0.080 minus 0.064, which is a point change of 0.016, and 0.016 divided by 0.064 is equal to 0.25, which is a 25% increase. For the second firm, we move from zero point 0.8 times zero point 0.8 times zero point 0.8 is equal to 0.512 to zero point 0.8 times zero point 0.8 times 1 is equal to 0.640. The change in this case is 0.128, which is again a 25%. However, the point value of the increase is much greater, 8 times greater for a double point value investment. The zero point 0.2 in the second firm versus zero point 0.1 in the first firm. If a firm can increase quality in percentage terms at constant marginal cost, or even a not too quickly rising cost, there is a virtuous circle in that the more the firm upgrades overall, the more value it obtains by doing so. Accordingly, wages will increase at an increasing rate as skill is steadily raised. As Kramer shows, the O-ring model is consistent with competitive equilibrium. The O-ring result of positive assertive matching relies on some rather strong assumptions. How important are each of these, and how much can they be relaxed? 2 points are crucial. First, workers must be sufficiently imperfect substitutes for each other. To see why workers must be imperfect substitutes, suppose they were perfect substitutes. Specifically, suppose there are two skill levels, QL and QH is equal to 2 QL. So every QH worker can be replaced by 2 QL workers with no other change. Thus, QH workers will be paid twice the amount that QL workers are paid. We can draw no predictions about what combination of worker skill levels a firm or an economy will use. So we can learn nothing about low skill level equilibrium traps. In fact, there is empirical evidence for imperfect substitutability across worker types in firms. The second crucial point is we must have a sufficient complementarity of tasks. To see why we must have a complementarity of tasks, suppose that there were two tasks indexed by G and H but with no complementarity between them. To be specific, suppose that our QH worker is higher for the G task and a QL worker is higher for the H task. Here, skills are imperfect substitutes for each other because only one type of worker can be hired for each task. Example, no two for one type of substitution is possible here. However, because tasks are not complementarity, the optimal choice of the skill for the G task is independent of that of the H task. And again, no strategic complementarities are present. Now, let's move forward to the implications of the O-ring theory. Firms tend to employ workers with similar skills for their various tasks because their productivity again depends upon those around them, and that will mean that they're having more productivity just because of the fact they're working with higher skill workers. Next, workers performing the same task earn higher wages in a high skill firms than in a low skill firms because higher income country because this higher wage, even though they're doing the same thing, they're employing the same skills they were before. Next is wages will be more than proportionally higher in developed countries than would be predicted from standard measures of skills. And indeed wages in this model are increasing with this skill level Q at an increasing rate so that Wages are more than proportionately higher in developed countries. Next is this type of income externally is by now a familiar condition in which multiple equilibria can emerge. So this is an income externality, and we see an income externality before when we look at the big push, and this is the condition in which multiple equilibria can emerge. And in fact, Michael Kramer in his original article about this approach of the O-ring theory did in fact show the shape of a relationship that we already talk about as being hallmark of typical situations of multiple equilibria potentially emerging. Now let's move forward to O-ring effects across firms. Economy-wide low-level quality of production traps may occur when there are O-ring effects across firms as well as within firms. It may occur, and this can be the case when firms are interacting and there's O-ring effects in the interactions among firms as well as what happens within firms. Next, such externalities can create a case for industrial policy to encourage quality upgrading, as in some East Asian industries. Industrial policy or industrialization strategy to encourage quality upgrading. Next is this magnifies effects of local production bottlenecks because they have a multiplicative effect on other firms' production. The production bottleneck because they have a multiple effect on other firms, so there's a bottleneck in one firm. One activity is going to spill out into others. Next is bottlenecks reduce worker incentives while lowering the expected return to investment in skill. As workers reduce their planned skill investments, this further reduces the level of skill in the economy and thereby lowers further the incentive to invest in skill. Next is such bottlenecks could be ameliorated with an alternative source of inputs through international trade and investment. So now, they ameliorated with some alternative source of inputs. One of those is through international trade and investment because the foreign inputs and investors provide an alternative source of inputs from outside the bottleneck economy. Explain why rich countries have larger firms specialized in conflicts products. We already looked at that to a degree when we examine our general classic theories of economic development in chapter 3. And with the larger firms, you're multiplying together a lot more activities. And so the problem of losing lots of value because of the equality of inputs goes wrong in a couple of the firms, because it very much larger and also shows why firm size and wages are positively correlated within and across countries because uh, there are many stages in which one has to invest value before you realize whether a couple of the inputs will have a low quality and may cost a lot of value in the process. Now let's move forward to economic development as self-discovery. Hasman and Roderick point out another market failure. There can be too much diversification after the point where the notion discovers its most advantageous products to specialize in. This is because there may be an extended period in which entry into the new activity is limited. Hausman and Roderick conclude that in the face of these market failures, the government policy should counteract the distortions by encouraging broad investments in the modern sector in the discovery phase. In fact, they also argue that the policy should in some cases work to rationalize production afterward, encouraging movement out of higher cost activities and into the lowest cost activities, paring down industries to the ones with the most potential for the economy. Not enough to say developing countries should produce labor-intensive products, because even if this even if this were always true, there are a vast number of such products in the world economy of today, and underlying cost of production of specific products can differ greatly from country to country. The, prod- the problem is information externalities associated with the need to search for a comparative advantage in efficient production opportunities. Innovators do not reap the full returns generated by their search for profitable activities. There will be too little searching for the nation's comparative advantage, too much time carrying on with business as usual, and too little time devoted to self-discovery. Industrial policy may help to identify through direct and indirect domestic cost of potential products to specialize in by first to encouraging exploration in first stage, and second encouraging movement out of inefficient sectors and into more efficient sectors in the second stage. So it is socially valuable to discover that the true direct and indirect domestic cost of producing a particular product or service in a given country are low, or can be brought down to below level. It is valuable in part because once an activity is shown to be repeatable, it can usually be imitated, at least after some lag, spawning a new domestic industry. Now let's go for the Hosman Roderick Velasco Growth Diagnostic Framework. So this diagnostic framework focuses on a country's most binding constraint on economic growth. So there's very special focus here is ended on an economy's relatively too low rates of investments and degrees of associated entrepreneur activities. And so the notion here is to associate this with the idea that no one size fits all in development policy. No one size fits all in development policy. In chapter 3, we saw four classic approaches to thinking about one general approach, and we discovered that they don't apply everywhere, even though we get significant insights from all of them. And so this takes into account many of the ideas of the different schools we've looked at so far, including some of the new contemporary models that are discussed in chapter 4. But you need to requires careful research to determine the most likely binding constraints, determine what is the most binding constraints, even for this more focused problem of looking at constraints on investment in entrepreneurship. Now let's tackle about the social returns and growth diagnostic. The first one is social returns. It is the profitability of an investment in which both cost and benefits are accounted for from the perspective of the society as a whole. Next is the growth diagnostic. Ricardo Hosman, Danny Roderick, and Andres Velasco, HRV, proposed a growth diagnostics decision tree framework for zeroing in on a country's most binding constraints on economic growth. Hosman, Roderick, and Velasco explained that targeting the most binding constraints has important advantages over other approaches to policy selection. The growth diagnostic is subject to some limitations and criticisms. One implications and assumptions is that development can be equated with growth, which in turn is held back by investment. This is a useful analytical assumption for this and a range of other purposes, but it does not and cannot provide a complete understanding of development purposes, mechanisms, and constraints. And of course, it is often not a simple matter to find a single binding constraint. there can be uncertainty about the position of each constraints in the economy. So we can only make a probabilistic assessment of which one is binding. If there are important complementarities between two investments, combining them in some sense should be considered. Further, the fact that one constraint is not binding today does not mean that we can neglect it when there are long gestation periods before current investments become productive. Now, let's move forward to the diagnostic decision tree. So the author looked at a decision tree approach in order to determine what is the likely most binding constraint on increasing private investment in entrepreneurship. So they divided the possible causes for this into two parts. One is a low return to economic activity specifically, and the other one is problems in financing high cost of finance. So the cost of finance can be in their analysis from two sources. One is international and one is domestic. So inability of the economy to bring in foreign investment, be able to borrow on foreign markets is something that might be addressed with policy. It may be the result of poor policies. There's also possible problems of bad local finance such as low savings or for financial intermediation banks and other financial intermediaries that don't do a very good job of getting resources available from the savers who have the money to borrow, who have productive uses for it, and this can be seen related to our growth models that we examine in chapter 3. On the other side, the real side, if you wanted the economy, not that the financial side is not real, but the problem could also be low direct return with respect to different economic activities, and the author is very reasonable divide this into two general areas as the tree begins to branch out further. One is that there are inherently low social returns. The other as well, C, is low appropriatability. So with respect to low social returns, we see that the authors have identified three general areas that were distinct, and they thought foundational one is poor geography and failure to address core geography, failure to improve a malarial environment, or failure to find some way around constraints imposed by being in a mountainous areas. Another possibility is bad infrastructure that might be the constraints, whether it be roads that are highly congested and not sufficient or ports and so on. And the third area could be low human capital, which can include, of course, education and skills, as well as health and some other areas. So any of these three might be the binding constraints holding back higher levels of investments. And then there's also this low appropriatability, and this falls to two categories: government failures and market failures, according to this decision tree. With respect to government failures, the authors for their final boxes here set out micro risk and macro risk as the two of a key interest. And so with respect to micro risk, we see here problems of poor institutions. So here, property rights may not be sufficiently strong to safely invest. So this may be holding back investments. Certainly, corruptions demands, the ability to demand bribes, for example, this can cut into the return on investment quite clearly, and so that as a result, this could be a binding constraints. And finally, taxes, not the existence of taxes, but taxes that are high as to be con- confiscatory. And so with respect to the low appropriatability through government failures, we have also the macro risk, and this can include financial instability, failure to get policies in place to prevent on the onslaught of financial markets crisis, monetary policy problems, failures to get inflations under control, For example, fiscal instability. So that these are a set of areas that could be the binding constraints on growth in addition to government failures. Markets failures can be of special importance, and remember, there's lots of possible markets failures, some of them at the micro level. Here, looking economy wide, the focus is on the kinds of market failures that can have economy-wide large implications for possibilities of growth and the development. And so one set of this has to do with information externalities, and uh, we've just talked about this in the self-discovery framework. Another has to do with coordination externalities, and this is something that we, of course, have been addressing with respect to the first parts of chapter 4, the possibility that a big push is needed because of pecuniary externalities, the possibility that the policy is needed to encourage investment because of strong complementarities, such as seen in the Oring example. In sum, one size does not fit all in development policy. Economic development strategies focusing on resource mobilization through foreign assistance and other capital flows, along with increased domestic national savings, can be most effective when the domestic returns are both high and privately appropriate. In contrast, strategies focusing on market liberalization and opening up the economy can be most effective when social returns are high, and the most serious obstacle to private appropriation are government imposed excessive taxes and restrictions. Now, HRV illustrate their approach with case studies of El Salvador, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic. So they argue that each case exhibits a different diagnostic signal of the most binding constraints. In El Salvador, HRV argued that this economy is constrained by a lack of productive ideas. So the binding constraints is a lack of innovation and demand for investment to replace the traditional cotton, coffee, and sugar sectors, or low self-discovery. So the best strategy focus for El Salvador would be to encourage more entrepreneurship and development of new business opportunities. In Brazil, HRV identified the country's binding constraints as lack of sufficient funds to invest despite an abundance of productive ideas. They argue that private returns in Brazil are high, and therefore other flaws: inadequate business environment, a low supply of infrastructure, high taxes, high prices for public services, weak construct enforcement and property rights, and inadequate education are not as binding in Brazil. So investment is instead constrained by Brazil's inability to mobilize sufficient domestic and foreign savings to finance needed investments at reasonable interest rates. Although Brazil could increase national savings to a degree by reducing government expenditure, this might not be politically feasible. If so, HRV suggests that higher taxes and user fees and lower in infrastructure and human capital subsidies might work. If the country can move to a faster growth path, and if waste does not grow with GDP, it may outgrow its burden and gradually improve its tax and spending system as fiscal resources become more abundant. In subsequent work, Hosman has emphasized the importance of creating a financially viable state that does not overborrow, overtax, or underinvest to successfully raise domestic savings. In Dominican Republic, HRV conclude that the Dominican Republic is constrained by core public goods in product sectors key for growth. The country began a new reform sequence during the 1980s, after it could no longer rely on sugar and gold exports. It followed a narrow strategy of investing in needed public goods for two emerging product or service sectors with high potential: tourism and maquila assembly manufacturing. The keys were security and infrastructure near the main tourist destinations and a special trade policy benefits for the light manufacturing assembly maquila sector. As the economy grew from these sources, the other constraints were hit, notably in the financial sector. Getting past them, or particularly a costly financial crisis, was bumpy. But the binding constraints stay or became visible, so policymakers could focus on relaxing them to keep growth going. Now, to further understand what is the growth diagnostic, let us watch this short clip.
Andres Velasco, Danny Roderick, and I worked on a project in 2003 in El Salvador. And we were confronted with the idea that at the time everybody was thinking that a growth strategy is just the implementation of a well-known list of to-dos. And the countries just had to go down the list of to-dos, and when they got finished, they would probably grow. We thought that that was an inappropriate way to think about how to make countries grow, that not all countries are stumbling against the same obstacles, against the same constraints, and that we could probably figure out a way of identifying what is the constraint that a particular country is facing. So we came up with a heuristic, with a method of identifying these constraints. So let's compare for a second El Salvador with, say, Brazil. So the first thing that comes to mind when you look at these two countries is that in El Salvador, interest rates are really, really low. So the cost of finance could not possibly be the reason why you don't see more investment, more entrepreneurship, more dynamism. But if you look at Brazil, it has some of the highest real interest rates in the world. So it must be that people in that country are still borrowing at these very high interest rates because investments must be really, really profitable, but they cannot secure the finance. So is the problem the cost of finance, or is the problem the fact that in spite of cheap finance, there are no investment opportunities in place? And this idea, applied systematically over and over, can help figure out where in the scheme of things the constraint might lie, and consequently where policies should focus themselves in order to relax a constraint that would permit further growth, and then constantly figure out what the next constraint might be, so that policies can be sequenced in a way that are constantly expanding growth opportunities.
Now let's move forward to the conclusion of contemporary models of development and underdevelopment. The first one is people keep doing inefficient things because it is rational to keep doing them, and it will remain irrational as long as others keep doing inefficient things. This leads to a fundamental problem of coordination failure. Sometimes firms and the other economic agents will be able to coordinate to achieve a better equilibrium on their own. But in many cases, the government policy and aid will be necessary to overcome the resulting vicious circles of underdevelopment. Next is the coordination failures that may arise in the presence of complementarities highlights potential policies for deep interventions that move the economy to a prepared equilibrium, or even to a higher permanent rate of growth that can then be self-sustaining. For example, once a big push has been undertaken, the government coordination may no longer be necessary. The unaided market can often maintain industrialization once it is achieved, even when it cannot initiate or complete the process of industrialization. The other one is the other edge of the sword, however, is that with deep interventions, the potential cost of a public role become much larger. These policy choices are more momentous because a bad policy today could push an economy into a bad equilibrium for years to come. This is because the government can be a major part of the problem, playing a key role in perpetuating a bad equilibrium, such as a high corruption regime, in part because some government officials and politicians may benefit personally from it. But bad policy can even initiate a move to a worse equilibrium than a country began with. To expect government to be the source of the reform that moves the economy to uh, to a better equilibrium in countries where government has been part of the complex nexus of a bad equilibrium can be naive. And that's end our presentation. Thank you for listening.